So with this video, I'm going to be talking about the conflicts between the United States, between China and Russia. And, well, I should say NATO altogether. But, with that said, this is going to be I would say a little bit more of an informed opinion on what is going on there. This isn't propaganda. This isn't American propaganda. This isn't Chinese propaganda. This isn't, a Russian propaganda. This isn't a news network propaganda. This is me gathering information and doing a little bit of research and giving my own opinion on this, including, I've did some research into different things. And I even watched a whole lecture from a professor at a university on this subject, especially during the 2014 conflict between Russia and Ukraine, back when Obama was the president, and the reason why he invaded into Ukraine, and how everything escalated more and more and more and more. So, so I am going to be mentioning, I have everything cited. I have references that I'm going to cite into the description. I'll also put a timestamp on the video when I start talking about the video. But the references I'll put in the description of the video. I'll also, it's also going to show on, in the video that I'm recording. So this is going to be my opinion on it. I'm going to just describe. It's going to be a shorter explanation of what's going on, because I've watched explanations on it that last up to over an hour, up to an hour and a half. I've seen a lot of people watch it too. But that was an old video, actually. It was during 2014 when Ukraine was initially invaded into by Putin. Which, I guess I could elaborate on that further, because that's not in the slides that I have. But going behind the reason Putin invaded Ukraine. So if we rewind back in time, back to the Soviet Union days, from my understanding, like I said, you could do extra research on this. This was back when the Soviet Union was a thing. But after World War II happened, the Soviet Union was abolished practically. If you look at the Russian Constitution or the Russian Federation, their laws and rights, they're all comparable to the rights that are claimed in the United States. So, with that said, that by itself should, put a big red flag on a lot of the things that are being said about Putin, him being a dictator. They do have elections. Obviously, there's some sort of corruption involved, but, who is to say in the United States? Because the United States is not true to itself, and the United States is in a perverted democratic state. And that may be true as well in Russia. I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure behind all the information, behind all the most recent assassinations and whatnot. But anyways, so it's going to be my opinion on it. And I'm going to go over it a little bit. Oh, yeah, excuse me. With the initial invasion from Putin, he went into, what was the Crimea. So there was a point in time that there was protests, and around 50 protesters. There was like civil discourse in Ukraine, in Crimea, from my understanding. This might be completely accurate word for word, but it's along these lines. There was conflict there, to the extent there could be civil war tensions, because some people wanted to be with Russia, some people want to be with Ukraine, and Ukraine was considered one of the most corrupt countries. I think it still is considered one of the most corrupt countries. But anyways, at the time, Crimea, there was a lot of discord there with the population. There were votes put together by in Crimea, that were more like pro-Russia. They're more pro-Russian, because Crimea, I'm pretty positive, initially was a part of Russia. There's a lot of, I think, Poland too. I don't remember. I'm not even going to speak on that part, what sections were initially Russian land, but a lot of, with Ukraine, I'm fairly positive that the main reasons for the conflict are that it was initially Russia's land, especially it started breaking off after World War II, and the Soviet Union was departed, and from that standpoint by itself could kind of make you understand that it's been something that they've been trying to reclaim for a long time. But there's that's where Putin starts to say that there's Nazism there, and it might actually be there still. I think there's collusion. Obviously, there's crime there, even to the extent where there was protesters there that were being shot by snipers. There was gas thrown out, and anyone that ran through the gas, there's snipers out there shooting protesters, from my understanding of what was going on around 2014. So there's people that wanted to be a part of Russia, and then there was also people that didn't want to be a part of Russia. There's some people that said they didn't. Anyways, so there was discord there, but then there was a vote that they wanted to be a part of Russia, and then NATO declared that it wasn't a valid vote, that wasn't something they could do. And to add to this, NATO already claimed a lot more territory for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I believe that's what it stands for. That's what NATO stands for. That's what the United States is a part of. That's what EU is all a part of. And this is my point in it, is that NATO was initially, in my opinion, being a little bit too aggressive, because obviously it's already a mess there. There's already corruption, and I just don't believe that they should be even getting involved there, especially since this is me adding my opinion on it, because there's a professor, he was saying that NATO shouldn't have even gotten involved at all, which was what sparked that. In a sense, you're taking, something they value as their own land, and obviously there's going to be some conflict there, and I don't think Putin's power is what would be described as a Soviet Union power, or anything extreme like there would be, during the World War II days, where Adolf Hitler was a thing. I'm actually pretty certain, that was probably around the time, shortly before he actually served in the military in Russia. But anyways, so this was partly a professor's opinion. The professor thought that that Russia initially, excuse me, I'm going to take a drink of water. He thought that NATO was, being a little bit too aggressive with its land claims, with its regional claims. And there was also a point in time where Putin wanted to be a part of NATO, from my understanding, but they denied it for whatever reason. And also, Ukraine isn't a vital asset to the United States or to NATO altogether. So that would add, it's not a vital value for the United States or NATO altogether. It's a small plot of land that has erupted into something that could possibly create World War III. Which, who wants a nuclear war over that? Nobody. And the argument also was that the professor made that Ukraine should stay as a buffer state until this is what the professor said. I'll get back to that later, but I'm also going to add to what the professor said was that at the time, they should leave Ukraine as a buffer state, which is, kind of a neutral zone. It's its own self, while its own country, or region, whatever you want to call it. And, obviously Russians value the area, and there are people in the area that also value, their Russian inheritance, or whatever you want to call it. The Russian values, some of them feel like it is Russia, some of them don't. Anyways, but, when it comes down to it, is it worth people dying altogether? I would say no. But anyways, I think this is getting to the point where the professor did say that it's NATO's initial fault because, well, not initial fault, but, their intent was to eliminate any corruption. But, with that said, at that point in time, it was more of a, something that could be solved in a crime, like law enforcement could have taken care of some of the issues without, anyways, it could have been settled within the state, I think. But, that was a point in time where Putin sent in his guys because, he felt, NATO said that stuff wasn't legal for them to take the region. I think it was Crimea, when they had a bunch of people voting that they wanted a more pro-Russian state. And that's where the conflict started in 2014. Which the whole thing is why would NATO want to get involved in that altogether? The whole point, from the get-go, why would they want to get involved in it? Like, why interrupt? And at that state, it seemed to me more that Putin had more of law enforcement type motives, like the United States had towards, Afghanistan, because it was more of a terrorist threat in the area more than anything, because I've even seen documentaries on, there's a lot of, lone wolf and, anti-government like groups or rebels that were ruling the area. So, with that said, I'm going to go over the introduction now, though. But I'm going to go over some information on how initially everything goes to play. I'm going to try to go through it quick so the video isn't too long. But, I'm making it trying to make it shorter than that professor's lecture was on the entire scenario. So I did make an assignment on this, but I'm going to try and read it to where it makes sense in a video. I'll be going over the tensions between the United States and Russia, Ukraine, and the China-Taiwan conflicts as well. So, first I'm giving a background of the United States government. I'm going to describe two leaders. I'm not going to go over every single thing, but this was for the assignment. I'm trying to mainly go over the information as of how the conflicts erupted initially, because they've been around for such a long time. I would say probably around as long as the last century almost now, because since World War II was how long those tensions have been going around the Cold War and, post World War II. So I am going to go over the United States government, I guess. I think some people, I'm not going to go over this, but, the values of the United States, I'll just go over the fact that, it's all about democracy, it's a democratic republic. It's about constitutional rights, which I would say more modern day, I think it's needless to say that a lot of leadership nowadays, there's more of a perverted governance over the United States right now that would be considered more communist than anything. And this is where the hypocrisy comes into play. There's more of a communist governing in the United States. I would dare to say borderline in Europe too, and EU as well, in that area, because even my time in the military, I shouldn't speak with just them, but I've felt that I've been spied on with my military service. Well, I know I've been spied on through cyber realms and whatnot, working at a nuclear base, the cyber threats and whatnot. I just feel like there is so much spying from everywhere. There's more of a communist state than a democratic republic almost everywhere at this point in time. Because I feel like, if you go down the street and ask most people, do they feel like they have their constitutional rights in the United States, they'll tell you no. So with that said, if they want to say that Putin is a dictator, period, that is just completely hypocritical. And, while I do believe that Ukraine has their right to, to equal opportunity like everyone else, I also don't think NATO should have gotten involved initially with that conflict, especially considering people in the area had Russian values and, there was so much corruption at the time, especially protesters being killed. That was back in 2014. Like I said, I believe, the references will be in here. And you can also look into the Crimea crisis in 2014. Okay. So, the most recent war tensions between Russia and Ukraine is a result of long-lasting tension between the two nations. Ukraine was a part of the Russian Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, but in 1917, a Russian Revolution brought down the empire, and Ukraine gained independence for a short time before it was taken over by the newly created Soviet Union. In late 1991, republics like Ukraine began to declare independence away from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union dissolved into independent countries, including a weakened Russia. Soviet Union sphere being diminished, followed by countries overthrowing their communist governments. So with that said, the Soviet Union power, which is, I would say, what is the main cause of everything, because it separated a bunch of areas. Initially, Ukraine was a part of Russia, and over time it's evolved like the United States has evolved, like a lot of different areas have evolved into more democratic states. So anyway, I'm going to continue. Belarus, Ukraine, and Georgia were they're the last post-Soviet Union countries between Russia and NATO when it comes to alliances, and both Georgia and Ukraine wanted to join NATO, obviously because of its the strongest alliance in the world practically, and that's where Russia wanted to start getting involved because it felt that Ukraine was a part of Russia, as well as some of the people there feeling as though they were a part of Russia. So Ukraine did become a NATO partner in 1994, which brought them a step closer to becoming a member of NATO, and in 2013 Ukraine reached an agreement with the EU, but Ukraine's pro-Russian government refused and instead chose to strengthen ties with Russia. So this is where the tension started to begin, because there was a pro-Russian government at the time, around 2013, and Ukraine's pro-Russian ties with Russia contributed to hundreds of thousands of protesters on the streets demanding an agreement with the EU. From my understanding, there was also, so this says this source says that, and then there was also another source that showed that there were people that were more pro-Russian than pro-independent Ukraine or pro-NATO, which led to the Ukrainian president at the time killing around 100 protesters. That's what it said on the video. I cited it. That's APA formatting citations. That's what the video mentioned. The YouTube channel Vox. So yeah, a bunch of protesters got killed while protesting in 2013 due to, some people wanting Ukraine to be part of NATO or to be independent, period. And, at the time there was discourse where some people had a vote. From what I understand, there was a vote, and there were people that wanted to have a more pro-Russian vote or be part of Russia. I don't remember. You'd have to look at the... when it comes to that detail, you'd have to look at a little bit further into that. But yeah, to continue on here, so a professor at University of Chicago stated that tensions between Russia and Ukraine escalated because of the United States and its desire to peel Ukraine away from the Soviet orbit, and the efforts to contributed to NATO expansion and EU expansion. So with that said, they wanted to break them out of a Soviet Union state. But this is also something I'm going to add to it is that Russia, modern day, is not a Soviet Union state. If you look at the rights they have, that they're given, as if they're given sincerely or not is questionable. I've never lived there. So with that said, when it comes to their laws in place, they have rights similar to the ones in the United States. They have privacy rights. They have court rights. Everyone has equal defense under law. And, while some may say there's people getting assassinated over there, who's to blame Putin on that period? You know, when you really think about it, there are things like that happening in the United States. There are a lot of people got killed. I mean, we've had assassinations in the United States. They could be lone wolf or people that are just patriotic for Putin or for Russia, period, and they want a sincere sovereignty in Russia. So he also mentioned the United States has been attempting to move its influence eastward since the Cold War, and Russia has been in opposition to that since that time. So yeah, with that said, from my understanding, there was also a point in time where Putin wanted to be a part of NATO, but for whatever reason, they didn't want him involved in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in NATO. And so pretty much they were leaving Russia out, but they wanted to bring Ukraine in and Georgia in. I think it's Georgia. They wanted to bring Georgia in because those were buffer states. They're in between. So EU's efforts were to eliminate corruption in Ukraine, like I said earlier, which was not a common motive in Ukraine because there was a lot of corruption, a lot of rebels and rogue groups in the area. Like I said, I've seen documentaries. They had their own militias and everything else to where it's like, practically, they're anti-government. They're like it's corrupt government. Anyways. So, these efforts were to eliminate corruption in Ukraine, which wasn't common in Ukraine, and he was looking to strike a deal with Ukraine and leave Russia outside, which Russia did not like. So, yeah, they were going to bring Ukraine into NATO, and they were going to leave Russia out, and they didn't like that. They didn't like that EU is having more of a capitalist-like type gain in land. They're going to gain capital, they're going to gain more resources with their alliance, and Russia didn't like that, especially it being, I'm pretty sure they value the area specifically because it was initially a part of Russia, and that's a rooted value, because if you really think about it, if a state like Texas was overran by Mexico or something, they would probably, be some tensions there when it comes to the values, and, there might be even a war over the area. So, yeah. It's also said that was mentioned that Putin's efforts were described as giving the West two options, which were to back off and leave Ukraine in the state it was in 2014, where Ukraine is a buffer state, or continue to push Western efforts to conform Ukraine, which will contribute to Russian response. So with that said, this is where Russia got involved because they didn't want the Western expansion there. And this is like needless conflict is what I'm talking about. The NATO started to get involved. It's just needless conflict. In my, without further information, I'm not a spy or anything. I'm not seeing every single detail of what is happening. But from looking at this information, this is gathered from like 7 different resources, including scholarly and credible sources. When it comes down to it, was needless conflict between countries. There was more of conflicts that could have been resolved from within rather than, a bunch of countries getting involved. Anyways, Russia didn't like NATO getting involved initially in 2014. And in a sense, when I think about it, if that was a part of my land and there's more, there's people that valued a Russian state there as well, you might think that you'd probably value the area to an extent. But anyways, It was also mentioned that the causes of conflict are due to the idea that Putin's behavior proves that it was wise to expand NATO eastward. So, this is where obviously the conflict starts. When you think prior to these things, like during Bush's administration, there's a point in time where the United States got along with Vladimir Putin. From my understanding, he even came into the United States. I don't think he's been in the United States since Bush. And it seemed to me like they were friends practically. And they got along with 9/11. And there was no skepticism between the two countries at the time. Anyways, so it's also mentioned that the causes of the conflict are due to Georgia. Oh, excuse me. Are due to the excuse me. It was also mentioned that it was not a great choice for the West to try to expand in Ukraine because it's not a vital interest for the West, and it could risk nuclear war with Russia. So yeah, this is the main point, in my opinion. The main reason NATO should have never even gotten involved. It should have been something, maybe some efforts should have been funded, hey, here's some money, you can resolve your conflicts. But them getting involved to where they want to expand, leave Russia out, it's just, I don't know. It is kind of funky in that sense where it's like NATO is just trying to expand its own, land, in a sense. I'm not really, I can't see through their minds and see every intent and thought. But, from observation, it looks more of, needless territorial expansion when there were no conflicts. And with that said, I'm also going to add to this that, there is practically a communist state where there's no privacy, there's no respect for privacy, there's no respect for copyright. There's practically no respect for any rights, almost, nowadays. Free speech. No, they're trying to take away free speech in the United States. All these values are disappearing, and, from what I've observed, it looks like, there were NATO countries that also were, violating those rights. So with that said, there's no respect towards any certain rights, and there's more of a greed in place because, in my opinion, anybody that's making decisions that is based on more of a selfish interest like that, like violating people's rights, going into your webcam and all this and spying on you, unless there's an actual valid reason to do that, why are they doing it, Like I said, I would say, competitions are sabotaged. I'm not going to get into that, but more online stuff is sabotaged and rigged to where, certain people are put on pulpits, whether or not they're spies, whether or not they work for the government or for the organization itself to save organizations money. It just feels more of a perverted capitalist state than anything. And that's where, I think that's the reason why I don't think NATO should have got involved or even tried to expand there, because specifically what, it could have helped and left it to itself to resolve its issues. But, the risk of nuclear war with Russia is it's just a bad, like the professor said this, it's making a bad scenario even worse. And it is making a bad scenario even worse. But yeah, a communist state I would describe as, lack of respect for basic rights. And this conflict has been growing since around then. I think it's been going on since the Cold War. It's been evolved from the Soviet Union, but I think that Russia has expanded past a Soviet Union state, but those tensions have been around for so long that, you know, we're at the stake we're at now. I just think that they initially should probably leave Ukraine in a buffer state to prevent death, because, obviously it's not worth it. That's putting it briefly. But, obviously there are people with ruined lives there. There are people with ruined lives in Russia. Why even continue getting involved over a plot of land? When you really think about it, I've met Ukrainians recently. I think that they left the area because they were forced out or whatever reason. They wanted to get out. There are opportunities for them to move to different places. I feel for them on both sides, but the thing is it's just not worth the end of the world. Over a plot of land. So, anyway, the tensions between China and United States. I'm going to get into that now. Which China and Taiwan has just as much history as Russia does with Ukraine when it comes to land. I think Russia has lost a plot of land. Some that I didn't mention, some that I should do a little bit more research into. I meant to do this before this, but when it comes to those details, from my understanding, they lost a lot of territory, but they're post-Soviet Union state, but they value those lands. There are people that value the lands. I don't know if it expands. I know that there's discourse on both sides. I just don't think that conflict should continue. I just think that they should leave Ukraine to be to be at a buffer state, maybe to vote, have elections or something, have some kind of diplomatic resolution about it, rather than having a bunch of people killed. I don't know why, but I haven't seen a lot of people, put out stuff like this. But anyways. I'm going to go around over the tensions between China and the United States as well. Because of the China-Taiwan tensions. The history between China and Taiwan goes back nearly a century. China has continually claimed Taiwan as its own, but the United States has always been between the two to intervene in China invading Taiwan. After World War II, Japan was defeated, was forced to give up control of Taiwan, and occupied it for 50 years. In turn, Taiwan was handed back to the Republic of China. Since 1927, there was a civil war being fought in China, which came to an end in 1949 after Mao's Red Army was victorious. As a result of this victory, a military dictatorship run by Kai-shek and its anti-communist supporters was forced to retreat to Taiwan. So, with Taiwan, So initially Taiwan was a part of China, but it was taken over by Japan for around 50 years, but it was returned back to China after World War II. But at the time, there was a civil war between 1927 and 1949. Mao's Red Army was victorious as more of a communist state. Kai-shek and his anti-communist supporters were forced to retreat to Taiwan. And that's where Taiwan was initially formed. When it comes to China's modern state, I'm not really sure about every detail of their laws. I don't think they're as comparable to Russia when it comes to a democratic republic, but this is also something where it's like it's almost like something that I don't feel like it's worth getting involved in either. To be honest, I feel bad for them, but when it comes to a war period, and the fact that it was initially their land, rather than them getting involved in war and having a more of a diplomatic resolution rather than war, like a restructuring of government out there. Like I said, I don't really know I don't really know all the Chinese or how they do things. So when it comes to those kinds of resolutions, I can't really speak on. But anyways, at the time, there were further efforts by Mao to pursue Kao-shek at the time. This was back in around World War II. War broke out between the Korean Peninsula, delaying the pursuit of Mao's Red Army to Kao-shek in Taiwan. This was during the Civil War, and this is where the United States got involved and formed an alliance with Chiang Kai-shek's regime, preventing Taiwan's pursuit by Mao. So, with that said, pretty much there was a civil war trying to overthrow a communist state, and the United States got involved and formed an alliance with Kai-shek. They were anti-communist country, and then Kai-shek at the time, which was the leader of the anti-communist party, was emboldened to retake China with America's support. And with that, there's been a continual conflict whether China was right-wing. There was a continual conflict whether China was a right-wing republic or a communist state. So with that said, I've never been there, I've never lived there, so I can't really describe how it is. I'd have to look into it. I know a little bit more about Russia because I feel like that conflict is a little bit more active than the Chinese one with Taiwan. But yeah, later economic efforts by China were to increase its economic power to an extent that would reunify Taiwan with China due to its dependence on China. So yeah, like I said, I'm not sure if that's completely accurate. That's what was said. Obviously, China is a big economical power. I think it might actually be the number one economical power in the world. In 1986, the Democratic Progressive Party was formed, which supported an independent Taiwan, and Taiwan's first democratic elections were held in 1991. So this is similar to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I'm not sure if China is a democratic republic either. But when it comes to it, I can kind of see from their perspective and them valuing the area specifically because it was originally a Chinese state. And it is such a small plot of land. And, getting a war involved and all that, it's just crazy to me. I don't know, man. It's just all over small plots of land that were historically theirs. And, obviously some of those values were probably brought into them. They're brought into that culture of valuing that land and certain values and whatnot. I don't know. I just don't understand why they can't come to a resolution that's more like, I don't know. It just doesn't make sense to me. I don't know why with the Taiwan thing, I'm not really sure what to say about that because it's just the communist states, they're trying to overcome that. I don't know. I don't know how that Mao was, but this is mainly war between Russia and Ukraine because I feel like it's more escalated with that than China-Taiwan. But anyways, I'm just getting super tired now, but I probably should have waited till the morning time to do this. But obviously Joe Biden and Donald. So I know this is also where where it talks about the Chinese's economical efforts to gain influence over Taiwan because it's such a small area. Taiwan would be dependent on China's economy, and therefore it would form, Taiwan into its governing by its economical power. And that's where I think Donald's efforts were to implement tariffs onto China for that reason. Whether or not they were justified tariffs, I'm not really sure every single detail of the trade between China and the United States. He says we're getting ripped off. I don't know if that's true. But overall, the way I would look at it is value per person, I should say. When you look at the population, obviously they're producing more. I'm pretty sure their population is a lot bigger. I think it's the biggest of any country. But anyways, with that said, when it comes down to it, it is initially their land. And that's where it's like, if you start taking, I don't know, man. It's just, to me, it's just not worth conquest and conquering and, hey, let's play conquer this, let's play expand everything. Like I said, I kind of have a mutual outlook on the whole thing, and it's just not something I would want to get involved in. In more of a war type motive. I do think that people of each country deserve to have equal opportunity like they would have in the United States. But when it comes to taking actions that could escalate conflict, it's just not worth it overall. Over a plot of land that's not vital, that could get everyone nuked, it's just not worth it. So yeah, obviously Joe Biden, I'm not going to go over that. But I am going to kind of close out. So I when it comes to Ukraine by itself, I kind of, a buffer state. Here, I'll Google that right now. A small neutral country situated between two larger hostile countries, serving to prevent the outbreak of regional conflict. It was a buffer state initially. And because it was originally a Russian state, I just don't think that NATO should have got involved. I don't know why NATO decided to get involved, in my opinion. I don't think that any kind of, Russia didn't necessarily attack the United States or anybody. But I'm pretty sure there was discourse within Ukraine itself because there are Russians with, like I said, Russians with Russian interests. There are also people with EU interests. From my understanding of what I've watched, people wanted to be part of NATO. They wanted Ukrainian independence. But like I said, all these sources overall Um, not every single one is scholarly, but there were credible sources. There were narration over the conflicts that happened as they happened, and some of them were scholarly sources, like a professor at a university, which is this one, the University of Chicago, John Marsheimer. These are all the references. I'll include them in the video. I'm not going to quote every single one, but with my conclusion on everything when it comes to modern day and America's claims, from what I've seen, claims of democracy. United States is in a very perverted democratic state. I would describe it more of a communist state from what I've seen. As far as whether or not that's from United States sources, I have seen that they all spy and stuff. They spy on people, not legally. People have rights. They have a history of that in the government, and I think because of that, it's evolved into more of a communist state that claims to have democratic republic values. But when it comes down to it, like I said, go ask Americans, do they feel like they have their constitutional rights? I bet you most of them will say no. If they know them, I think most of them might not even know them. So, anyways, with that said, with NATO we're pushing a dictator out. It's just, to me, that's just like you're trying to start conflict saying that kind of stuff. Like you shouldn't. When it comes down to it, period, I think they should have left it to its own. Because not with every detail involved, without seeing every single detail, from my understanding, it was Putin's intent to rid of, those people killing the protesters. From my understanding of everything. Some might have conspiracy theories that it was his guys. I'm not really sure. But, when it comes down to it, I think that the conflict could have resolved itself by leaving it to itself, because I'm pretty sure he invaded there specifically because of the EU expansion, the NATO expansion that was coming there. And if it was left to itself, there may not have been escalations there. When it comes down to it, why is it that the election between Joe and Donald would change the war? I don't know. Is it because of NATO expansion coming out of the Obama administration and out of the Biden administration? And is it because Donald wants to leave it to itself? I don't know. When it comes down to it, I just don't think that NATO should even try to get involved or escalate. Simply while, obviously they should have some sympathies for people within the conflict, but it's just not worth the death that's happening there. It's just not worth it. It's not worth a nuclear war. It's not worth going into a war against another nation that, from my observation, is more of a democratic republic similar to the United States and its core values. Whether or not they're sincere, like I said, I don't know. But when it comes down to the United States itself, I would not consider the United States to be true to itself. It is not authentic. It's not authentically the way it's meant to be. There's a lot of perversion in processes in the United States, obviously. But anyways, I think that just obviously there's been mafia-related leaders leaders involved in collusion and leaders involved in the mafia, whatever groups you want to call it, with Freemasonry, rooting into the government and important positions that are creating corruption in the United States and, anywhere in the world. But anyways, so I'm going to close out there. That is my final opinion on everything. I just don't think NATO should expand, should get further involved, should have initially gotten involved, because that was a point that was made in the video, why it was partly the West's fault for expanding into the Ukrainian area by, alliances, when it is part of Russian territory. Anyways, I just don't. It's just, in my opinion, it's just not worth the land. It is a complex and bad scenario, but overall, I think these tensions would die off if you give it a decade or two. If you give it a decade or two, maybe 3, the tensions and wars will die off to where, there won't be tensions that way. I just don't. When it comes to NATO's response, from my experience with the United States government and probably likely NATO allies and their spying, I can't stand it. I fucking hate it. I fucking hate spying. I hate not having privacy. And I hate not having constitutional rights. With that said, I'm not confident in every single leader of NATO, or the United States, to make decisions on behalf of me or even anybody in the United States that even knows or does not know their rights, because they're not running the country right. But anyways, I'm going to close out there. But if you did watch through the whole thing, thank you. Here's all the references. You can look at all the references if you want to. There's also an additional reference, which was on the Crimea conflict in 2014. You can do your own research on that if you want. I'm not trying to make anybody have their own opinion on it. But when it comes to it, I just wanted people to be a little bit more informed, because this was something I wanted to do. This is something I was meaning to look into more, so I could give a more informed opinion on it. Because I just didn't feel confident in what was going on. And, some of the leadership, I'm just not confident in their integrity. I'm not confident in their sincere efforts towards democracy and a republic, because it's an upside down, perverted state. It is a perverted upside down America right now. So anyways, I'm gonna close out there. If you watched, thank you. Like if you want to, I'd appreciate it. You don't have to subscribe, but I love getting involved in things like this. I like getting into information like this. And I do like making videos on it. So, with that said, like and subscribe if you'd like to. And have a good night. Thank you for watching.